during World War II, when we were allies actually with communist Russia, and then he left it because, according to the FBI files, he didn't like them telling him what to do, and he didn't appreciate that, and he said he would not accept their advice in how he should run his cases, and he quit. But nevertheless, he was someone with a perspective on society that, you know, the wealthy should not exploit the poor, and people who are exploited should look out for each other. And divides of race were, you know, not the main divide in society. The main divide in society was between people who worked and wanted to better themselves, and people who took advantage of those who worked and tried to better themselves. So that was his perspective. But he had a wide range of clients, and took on a lot of different, you know, he was self-employed, which is why he could afford to be progressive in his politics. This was in the late 40s and 50s. If you were had progressive politics, you could be fired from your job, but he was self-employed, so he could. And he took on a variety of cases, but in 1956, a Black couple came to him, and it changed the course of his political, well, his legal career. And so the next slide, I'll show them. This was Albert and Sallie Bolton. And I found this out by looking into my father's papers as an adult, something I had not been able to do as a child, or not had the knowledge or ability to really do the research as a child. Around 1956, 57, this couple, a Chicago couple, came to my father, and they had heard, you know, they don't remember. I interviewed the wife in this couple, Sallie Bolton, in the late 90s, and she said she didn't know how they found my father, but she said they came to him. They're a Chicago couple, both children of, you could say, well, migrants. They were both, their parents had migrated from the South to Chicago, and they were both raised in Chicago. And they came to my father with an issue in the 56 or 57. And it was a problem they were having with about real estate. And what they told him was that they had purchased a house, and they said, you know, we bought it, and we were keeping up with the payments, but we've fallen behind, and now our we're being told that we're going to be thrown out of this house, and we want this thing to stop. We want a little more time. We know we fell behind in our payments, but we should still be able to stay there just a little longer. And they were asking my father for help with this problem. This was a very turning point in his career, because what happened was he asked them, tell me the address, tell me about the house. And they told him about the address. It was a house on the south side of Chicago in a neighborhood called Hyde Park, which was then still majority white, and but racially changing. And so he looked up the house, and he said, "What did you pay for this house?" They said, "We paid about $14,000 for the house." And in 1956, you could buy in 1956 a new house in the suburb for $5,000, and they were paid $14,000 for their house in the city. And my father thought, well, that's odd. That's an awful lot of money. So then he, you know, and the house wasn't in great shape, and it didn't make sense. So he looked up the property records on this house, and then he came back to the Boltons, and he said, I got to tell you what I found out. He said they told him that the house had been sold to them by a man named Jay Garan, who was a real estate broker, and he sold them the house for $14,000. So what my father found out when he looked in the records was that Garan didn't just sell them the house, that he had owned it himself, that it was his house that he sold them, and that he had purchased this house only a few weeks before he sold it to them. He bought it for $3,900. So about $4,000, and sold it to them for $14,000. So triple markup. And they were, you know, shocked. They had no idea that this man had done that, that the price had been inflated so much. But that wasn't the only problem. My father said, you know, you realize you don't really own this house, right? You know, he said, you know, he sold it to you on something called an installment contract. And what it means to buy an installment means, it basically, an installment contract means like you buy a house on installment, like you would buy a car on installments. It means you put some money down, you're responsible for taxes, maintenance, interest, and insurance, but you don't own the house until the very last payment has been made. And that was the way that this man, Jay Garan, sold them their house. He sold it to them on an installment contract. And it left them that, and that's why by falling behind on a payment or two, he could evict them. He still owned it. And when you buy with a mortgage, if you miss payments, it takes a while for the foreclosure process to start. And it costs a lot of money for the bank to initiate it. But if you fall behind on an installment contract, they could throw you out after 1 month. And the cost of initiating the eviction is was $4.50, the same as it cost to initiate an eviction for a renter. The difference, of course, is that they had put down I think they put down $750 on the house at a time when you could buy, again, a new house, putting down $250 for a new house. I mean, so their down payment was massive. The cost was massive. They had done all these repairs on the house. They miss one payment, and now they're going to be thrown out, you know? So they're in this horribly vulnerable position, and they didn't know, you know, they're like, well, something's wrong here. But once they learned from my father that the man who sold them the house wasn't just a broker, that he was actually the owner of the house, they said to him, you know, we want to fight this man. We don't want to just stop the eviction. We want to stop him. And that was the start of my father's battles, instigated by a client, to fight this predatory practice of selling Black people in Chicago houses on contract, on the installment contract, usually at double and up to quadruple the price that the person who bought the house and flipped it to them had paid. But I just want to say briefly, if you might wonder, like, why would the Boltons, you know, who you see here in this photo, happy in their new home that they would soon lose, why would they agree to buy a house for $14,000 on installment? You know, like, why didn't they get a cheaper house, you know? And why did they buy an installment contract? And the answer to that goes to the next slide. It has to do with, of course, redlining. And I heard Bankole was saying, you know, that many of you in the audience are very familiar with that. And, you know, so I won't go into it, but essentially from the 1930s onwards, the federal government, through the Federal Housing Administration, guaranteed mortgage loans to encourage banks to make those loans. But they wouldn't guarantee loans in Black neighborhoods. And that was called redlining, the refusal to loan in Black neighborhoods. And this is a map of Chicago, and it's they had these maps for every city and every town across the country, where they showed in red, don't loan here, yellow, maybe loan, blue, yeah, you should loan, green, absolutely loan, you know? And so this shows these areas that were areas of especially Black and Mexican then residency, where they would not loan. So the Boltons couldn't have gotten a mortgage loan if they'd wanted one, because just by the way that the appraisers worked was that they assumed that if a Black person moved to a white area, they thereby integrated the area and made the area worth less, so you can't loan to them. If they stayed in an all Black neighborhood, you also didn't loan to them or want to insure a loan for them, because as a result of white hostility, Black Chicagoans were crammed into a small neighborhood. In this area, you can see more or less, also further south. And those areas became overcrowded, and banks didn't want to insure, or the FHA didn't want to insure mortgage in an overcrowded old area, nor would banks loan in such areas. So they couldn't get a loan if they stayed in the crowded, overcrowded area that Blacks were allowed to live. They couldn't get a loan if they moved out of the overcrowded area that Blacks were allowed to live. And just to say about Detroit, the issue was not, so what happened in Chicago between 1940 and 1960, the Black population about quadrupled. It went from about 270,000 people to over 800,000 people. By 1960, there would be 1 million, by the early 60s, 1 million Black people in Chicago. It's 1/3 of the city. All these people were being, in the war years and into the 50s, restricted to a small area on the south side of the city. There was a huge pent-up housing demand, and they had the money to move out of these areas, you know? And this is something Black Chicagoans in the 50s had the second highest income level of Black people in the nation. First highest was Detroit. That's where people had jobs and they had money. And there was studies in 1955 said 45,000 Black Chicago families were of middle-class income and desperate for housing. And that, to some extent, characterizes the Boltons. They had been living in the South Side in a really crowded area. They wanted their kids to have better educational options. They needed a bigger place. They had the money. They couldn't get a loan. So they had to turn to a speculator to get out. And they knew the price was high, but it wasn't necessarily higher, that much higher than the overpriced housing they were paying rent on. So, it wasn't a stupid decision or an illogical decision. It was just a dangerous decision. And but it was a decision. What kind of decision is it when there's no other choice? That's actually not a decision. That's just like the only way you can do it. So they took this chance when they found a real estate guy who said, I got a house for you. It's in a nice area. Okay, the cost's a bit much, but you're both working. They decided we're going to do it. What they didn't quite realize was the dangers of the installment contract, that it put them so vulnerable that with one missed payment, they could lose their home. And the thing was that the way things operated in Chicago, it was easy to get someone to miss a payment if you wanted them to, because all you had to do was send the housing inspectors out. And they could look at your house and say, the windows aren't right, the back porch not quite right, and the cost is $200 a day if you have a code violation. So sometimes, when Black people moved to white neighborhoods, code inspectors would come around to kind of push them out. And if they bought on contract, it was quite easy to do so. On the other hand, if they missed a payment, they lose the property. The white speculator who was able to get good loan money to buy the house in the first place, they get the house back and they could resell it. So this was the situation that the Boltons found themselves in. You can go to the next slide. It was a desperate situation, and it's enabled by a larger system. By the way, my father, when he looked into the story of the Boltons, and when they asked him, they said, you need to bring Jay Garand to court, and you need to say what he did was, the charge was against Jay Garand, by the way, was that it wasn't so much that he sold them the house on contract. It was that when he did so, not only did he lie and not tell them he was selling them his own house, he also said, when they said, well, the price is high, we just want to talk to an attorney and make sure everything is fine. Jay Garand said, no, I'm an attorney. I'll be your attorney. Why waste the money? I'll take care of this whole thing for you. By the way, very similar things happened in the subprime mortgage crisis, where people would take multiple roles. I'm your appraiser, I'm your seller, I'm your attorney. And guess what? That's not so safe. So he said he was their attorney and that he would take care of them. Then he used his knowledge to drain their money. And that's, what the Boltons argued against Jay Garand when they brought their suit, was that he had a fiduciary relationship with them when he said he would be their attorney. That means that, obviously, if you're a professional, a fiduciary relationship means, you operate on your client's behalf, not your own. He clearly had not done that. He had clearly operated on his own behalf after saying he was their attorney. So that was the argument that my father made in his case against Jay Garand. And he also said that what he did, if not illegal, was unconscionable. And he listed the whole story. And it was through I found the law papers, and then I found Sallie Bolton, and that's part of how I uncovered the story of this situation. My father lost that case. The judge said a contract is a contract. They signed, they owe, the end, But it launched my father on a big crusade to stop this practice, because it wasn't long before many other Black Chicagoans started showing up and saying, you know, this has happened to me too. And that's because he wrote about it. And I'll show you that in a minute. But first, I just want to show you the context for contract selling, that is selling on installment contract. You can see this is a headline from 1960. It says, Lawndale credit squeeze. That's a West Side Chicago neighborhood where my father was born and raised, that was becoming more and more Black by the 50s. It says, wanted mortgages, meeting tonight to air the problem. Credit squeeze. They knew they couldn't get loans. Could show the next slide. It didn't matter how good your credit was. This is another newspaper account from the Chicago Daily News, which is a white newspaper, by the way, not a Black paper. They're still noting, call Negroes good home loan risks, but Illinois Federal Savings and Loans, as a type of bank, has tough requirements. So it's still saying, it says something like 3,000 mortgages wanted. So it didn't matter how much money you had. It didn't matter how long you'd been at your job, how much savings you had. If you were Black, you could not get the credit. And these newspaper accounts show how open that was, and you know, widely discussed. The next slide. They also couldn't move to the suburbs, whether, again, this isn't about not having money. This is a common myth that Black neighborhoods became impoverished because Black people are poor and poor people have poor neighborhoods, and that's all there is to it. What I found, and I'll describe to you, is that Black people certainly in Chicago, and even more so in Detroit, had a good income level and could have built wealth, but were prevented from doing so by redlining on one hand, and even more so by predatory real estate practices that drained wealth from them, instead built it. So while white people were moving to the suburbs with guaranteed easy, low cost, easy credit, guaranteed loans from the federal government, and putting $200 down for a brand new $5,000 house, people like the Boltons were left to put $750 down on a $14,000 house in the city that was old and that they didn't even own. And they couldn't move to the suburbs where the costs were low, because the suburbs were closed to them. This is an article from the Chicago Defender, I think it's again 1962, and it says in small letters, the Chicago Wall. And then it says, predict suburbs to open in the next 5 years. And they're saying, we think the suburbs will open in 5 years. We hope so. It looks like they might. Let's hope they do. But look at this open thing here, you know, that they couldn't go there. Wealth was being built in the suburbs with federal help. Black people were walled in some ways, metaphorically, to the city and charged these exorbitant prices to buy homes. And I have to say, historians used to say, you know, we know there's something called blockbusting, where white real estate, and sometimes Black real estate interests too, would go into white neighborhoods and say, Black people are coming, sell to me, and you know, while you can. And then they'd say these people would buy low from whites and sell high to Blacks. But you know, my question was, like, how could you sell high to people who can't get a mortgage? How do you do that? And installment land contracts was one of the ways that happened. Okay, so the next slide is, this just shows you the installment land contract, what it looked like, and why you might not be so clear on every detail of it. It's very small print. It looks a fair amount like, you know, it's a legal contract. But I think in this one, it's number 9 or so. In very technical language, it does say, if you miss a payment, of any of the payments due here, you lose the house. So this was how it was done. So we could go to the next slide. So my father, you know, was horrified by what happened to the Boltons and losing the case for them. And he started to write about it. And this is when he started to write in the Chicago Defender. This is from April of 1958. It's one of my father's first articles about the unethical situation in law and of contract selling. And he writes in the first line, the penalty to the Negro people for real estate injustice is $1 million a day. He says that's the cost that Black people have to pay just for living here, $1 million a day. he also calculated that he looked at all the want ads in the black press, and he saw that he could tell when it was a contract sale, because they would say a contract sale, they would say, you know, how much you put down, how much a month, but they wouldn't say the final price. And based on that, he calculated 85% of homes that Black Chicagoans were buying were being sold on contract, and which is a very high number. So picture up to 1 million Black people in Chicago. I mean, obviously they're not all buying homes, but a large number of people buying homes on contract and being exploited to the tune of $1 million a day, which he called the speculator tax. It's the extra they had to pay because they couldn't get a bank mortgage. So he knew this was a problem, and he could see that it was destroying communities, as did the people who lived there. You can go to the next one. And people started, once my father wrote that one article, that's how he got more clients saying, it happened to me, it happened to me. And soon he had lots of people that he was arguing for in multiple ways. And sometimes the speculators settled and sometimes they didn't. But meanwhile, he felt it was his mission. Again, I'm taking my father's side of this because I'm his daughter, and that's what led me into it. There are other ways to look at this, but he started to publicize the issue. And this is one of the handbills, Fight for Your Property, 2 giant mass meetings. One's on the west side, one's on the south side. And it says, come here, Mark Satter, talk about this conspiracy between the mortgage bankers and insurance underwriters to deliver the property of Negroes to the hands of the exploiters. That is the real estate speculators. So that was going on. And again, this started to create a snowball effect. And Black Chicagoans, of course, had known about this. It was obviously how they bought. But what my father did was bring it into the white press as well. You can do the next slide. And he talked to meetings. This was the Greater Lawndale Conservation Commission in the West Side. And, you know, I like the picture mainly for the picture, the expression on the faces of the people who are listening to this story, as he's explaining in this particular commission precisely how dangerous contract selling was and the ways speculators were taking advantage of their community. The man sitting next to him was one of those speculators, and he got up and said, hey, you pay in a capitalist society, you pay what you can pay. But anyway, the effort was made to publicize this situation. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And the people who were buying were, they were small, in every community, the local whites who were being, there was like a few people among the local white people who would realize I can make a lot of money selling to Black people on these exploitative terms, and they would turn around and buy up properties and resell them. I'm just seeing some picture of some of them. This was Mo Foreman, who ended up owning hundreds of properties that he sold at exploitative terms to Black buyers. The next one you could show also, next slide. Some of them, Lou Wolf and Al Berlin, they look like hoods, like, i.e. they look like rough guys. They were rough guys. Some of them later set fire to their own buildings. But anyway, there they were. These were just some of the contract sellers, just so you see who they were and what they look like. They would all later be brought to trial by Black contract buyers. You can do the next slide. And, you know, as the word got out, more people started talking about, you know, how this whole thing, you know, what it meant, both to the Black press and the white press. So this is the Black press saying that, pointing out that the law backs the housing racket, contract buyers at the mercy of Sharpies. And this tells some heartbreaking stories about older Black people saving their money, owning property, and then losing it all to a contract seller. Next slide. Again, this is the Chicago Courier, the $1 million a day cost of being Black. That's something that my father had talked about, that other people talked about. And it started to become, as you can see, big news by the early 60s. And this next slide, this shows the map of Chicago. You could see where it's blank on the right side is Lake Michigan, and it goes north and south along the lake. And that's the same area around where you can see it's dark, is sort of where there was redlining. It's where Black people were living in 1940. They were all crammed onto the southern narrow strip heading south. That's Chicago 1940. And the next slide shows 1960. You can you can see how much bigger it got, you know. So the Black population is expanding into the west side and further south of a segregated city, most through buying on contract, again, paying way more than they should. So next slide is a quote. This is every time one of those, you saw that shift from the small to the, how the population is expanding, going up to 1 million from about 270,000. And this is something that a middle-class Black homeowner said in 1959. He said, face it, racial prejudice is profitable in Chicago. Every time a new parcel of land is added to the bronze ghetto, millions of dollars in real estate profits are made. And that was an accurate point. Every time one property turned over, in all likelihood, it was from a white person who was getting a little less than they should have gotten, but happy to get it and still able to take the cash that a speculator gave them and move out to the suburbs. And then a Black buyer who's paying way more than they should. And who's taking that cut? It's the speculators. And the speculators then, they're making so much money that they end up selling, they have a contract that says, that they buy a house for $8,000. They sell it for $16,000 from a white person. They sell it for $16,000 to a Black person. They take in the payments for a while, and then they say, I'll just sell to another white person. I'll sell this contract for the house. It's worth $16,000. I'll sell it to you for $12,000. And so somebody buys this contract at a discount, and then they collect the payments. So it kind of spread out through the professional classes in the city of Chicago. That is the ownership of these properties. The next slide. Now, my father died in 1965, and in 66, Martin Luther King came to Chicago, and he was told about exploitative contract sales. And he came to the same neighborhood, Lawndale, on the west side, that my father had lived in, and that many of these contract sales were concentrated. But he did not take on the issue in the end. He decided to take on the issue of open occupancy, which is, the process by which, he wanted to fight the process by which real estate professionals refused to show homes to Black people. My father's more interested in, what they paid. But, so King came to Chicago. He led an important crusade there in 1966, but he couldn't tackle the housing issue. And I'll just show you the next slide. He moved to one of the most decayed parts of what was by 66, a very decayed part of Chicago where contract sales had been concentrated. Homes had been sold over and over, never maintained, the Black buyers thrown out, sold to another, thrown out, sold to another. And he wanted to move there to show the situation there. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, he'd already won the Nobel Prize. He was a bit of a celebrity. I mean, and when he went through, the landlords said, "Oh my God, Martin Luther King's renting my place." And so as he came in, they cleaned it up, so that he couldn't use it. It was tricky on their part. So I'll show you the next part. He moved into the slum to show how bad it was, and as soon as he got there, they cleaned it up. And because that's how, in Chicago, they were clever, and they were going to fight back that way. They weren't going to let themselves look bad, even if they were bad. So that's what happened. And there was talk in the paper. They said, if Martin Luther King wants to clean up the slums, he should just keep moving to new apartments, because, the landlords will keep cleaning up each one he lives in. So the point was that, coming in the way he did, it was a hard thing for him to tackle. It was a different thing. The city was bigger, and he couldn't really, he wasn't able to get a handle, certainly on the housing issue. And there's books about his battles with Mayor Daley, who was the mayor of Chicago, who fought him quite hard. But the next slide we'll get to. I'm trying to get to the end here. Though King left the city in 66, a few years later, some activists local activists were still around. And this is a picture of one of them, Jack Egan. He was sent to the West Side as a punishment by his cardinal, because he was too involved in racial justice. And he said, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. I love living here. I love living among Black people. I love learning what's really going on in the city. Finally, I have a chance to do that. So Egan was sent out to the West Side. He pulled in white Catholic money to help him launch an organizing crusade on the West Side. He was able to do that by tapping his networks in a city that is largely Catholic. So you can show the next slide. He started pulling in seminarians who then in turn pulled in local residents to start organizing door to door. One of them is Jack Macnamara, who died just a few weeks ago. And they went to door to find out what's going on in the community. And what they found was that people were saying, well, we got a lot of problems, but our housing payments are the worst. They're just overwhelming. They're crushing us. And he's like, well, why? What do you mean? And they told him, well, they told him what they were paying on their houses. And he was stunned because they were paying, double, triple, sometimes quadruple what his family paid in the white part of the city. So he knew something had to give. And the Black contract buyers were actually at first ashamed to talk about, they felt they'd been scammed and they didn't want to admit it. But I want to just say also that when you bought on contract and you spend, and you're forced to pay, so much more every month, it means you cannot maintain your property. You dare not, because you put extra money into that property, you cannot miss a payment or you're out. It means you subdivide the property because you have to make those payments. It means that if one parent is working, both parents start working because you got to make those payments. It means that your kids come home from school and there's no one there because, both parents are working because they have to make those payments. And it leads to decline of the communities. In Chicago, in these neighborhoods where people were subdividing their homes because they had to make their payments, school populations were doubling, but, teachers, same number of teachers. You had, grade schools going from 2,000 kids in them to 4,000 to 5,000. It was impossible to learn in those situations. Population densities were growing. Garbage was not getting picked up any more than it had been before. So, kids come home out of school and the parents are working, there's no one to watch them, they're unsupervised. And so what white people saw when Black people moved into their neighborhood was that things went to hell fast and they didn't know why. They saw the maintenance declining. They saw the population density growing. They saw garbage wasn't being picked up and they saw kids were running, without supervision, or so it appeared. And they're like, what's wrong with them? We need to get out of here. And here's a speculator saying, I'll buy your house. I know it's worth 8,000. I'll give you 7, go, and they would go, often bitterly, often angry that they felt driven out. But the Black people moving in are facing all those same conditions, working night and day to keep their properties. And many did keep properties. Many didn't, but many did, despite all the odds, and find themselves blamed for the problem, and then they can't leave because they can't sell because they don't own it. So it's a nasty trap, and that was what was happening by the late 60s after my father's death, when these new, people came, and just by listening to the residents started to hear some, pretty shocking stories about what they were paying. So it started with, again, the sort of a Catholic activist who was close with Saul Alinsky, who's a famous community organizer, sending out seminarians, who worked for free to talk to people. The next slide. It shows soon they got local African Americans involved and leading the organization in this neighborhood. And they formed something called the Contract Buyers League. And it was a group of and that's Clyde Ross at the top. And Clyde Ross, in recent years, he was featured in Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations. Clyde Ross is still alive, and he told his story in that article. But here's a picture of Clyde as a young man and also Lucille Johnson, another major leader of the Contract Buyers League. These people had all bought on contract, had all paid too much, were furious, and began to come together and talk about how to fight back against the contract sellers in the late 60s, after King left the city, after attention shifted away. The next slide. And I'll stop soon. This is another major Contract Buyers League activist, Sidney Clark. And the next one is Ruth Wells. These were the main people who took leadership. They were all like middle-aged, and you usually associate, sometimes the activism with younger people, but these are people who had been there in Chicago a while, had, were tired of working round the clock for, in an effort to keep their homes when they should have been able to build community instead. So the next slide is, they decided that they would go on payment strike. First, they said to the contract sellers, we're willing to, they said, it's fair enough for you to get a profit, like a fair profit. They said, why don't you take a fair profit of what you sold to us, say 15%, pretty fair, not 80%, not 100%, 15. And if you can't, and renegotiate these contracts so that you're getting a profit of 15% instead of 100. They refused, the contract sellers refused. So there ended up, so they said, how do we force them to act? How do we force them to renegotiate? They decided, there were, by the 68, there were 3,000 people in the Contract Buyers League, all Black West Siders and South Siders. They decided to not make their payments. That meant they could be evicted. It was very bold, but they said, we're going to hurt them by withholding our payments en masse. The Chicago police came out to evict them, and this is a picture of that. And the next picture shows that activists came and moved them back in. And another slide, the next one, on the West Side too, saying, no, we're not letting you evict us. And it turned into a huge political battle in the city of Chicago that people said, it looks like the Depression era 30s. There's people having their stuff thrown out, their stuff being moved back, what's going on? And it ended up leading to a huge court fight where, which I'm not gonna go into because I'm almost out of time. I just wanna show you, but they did about a large percentage of the contract buyers of Chicago who were in the Contract Buyers League ended up getting some negotiation of the contract, saving approximately $14,000 per person, which we have to multiply by 8 to know what it is today. It's a lot of money. It was one of the most profitable actions to put money back of any community organizing in the period. Also, their activism led to research on mortgage exploitation that funneled directly into the activism that led to the passage of the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and the Community Reinvestment Act. So there's a lot more. I'm not going to go into it. You can just go to the next slide. Contracts were negotiated. That's an example. And the next slide. What I really want to say briefly and then stop is that now these contracts have come back with a vengeance. This is this is just the cover of something that any of you can get online. It's called Toxic Transactions, How Land Installment Contracts Once Again Threaten Communities of Color. This is from July 2016. It's from the National Consumer Law Center. It's pretty shocking, and it gives you a national overview, because now that people can't get loans now because the houses are worth too little. So now it's hedge funds are buying up hundreds of properties, selling them on contract to people who can't get mortgages other ways, in part because the homes in their neighborhoods are not worth enough for a bank to give a loan on. And then they get thrown out if they miss payment. Next slide. I also want to say that we've started researching this, and some researchers completed a study in 2019 called The Plunder of Black Wealth in Chicago. Next slide. It was from the Samuel Du Bois Center at Duke University. They found that over 2 decades, the amount of wealth, land sales expropriated from Chicago's Black community was between $3.2 and $4 billion. Now that is money, and they did a very, very careful study. Again, The Plunder of Black Chicago is, you could find it online, the PDF, you could download it, and you can find all the details there, how they did the study, how they came up with this number. They found that the average markup on homes sold on contract in Chicago between the mid 50s, the early 50s and the early 70s, the average markup was 84%. So what the Boltons experienced was not out of line. Average markup on the home sold was 84% higher than what the person who sold it to them had bought it for. And they give the example, a home sold purchased by a speculator for $12,000 would be sold to a Black buyer weeks later for $22,000. And then they go into how much they paid more a week. They found that between 75 to 95% of the homes sold to Black families during the 50s and 60s in Chicago were sold on contract. They also paid more in points and interest, and it came to $3.2 to $4 billion, which is, that is not even including home insurance premiums and other premiums. So you want to know why these neighborhoods look the way they do. It is not because people happen to always eternally be poor. They are wealth is drawn out of these neighborhoods. That's a really key point. Next slide, and I'm almost done. Well, this just says that it could be more. And you could look at that. I'm not going to read it to you. Next slide. But it does say that many people managed to keep their homes. And it says that what they're hoping to do by documenting how much money was plundered from Black homeowners over these decades, they want to inform policymakers as to the scale of proactive reinvestment that might begin to redress this problem, educate the public, encourage policy initiatives to fight contract sales, which are back, and other forms of predatory lending, and start a new narrative about how this whole thing works. So that's the end. And sorry, I went over slightly. And I'm happy to answer questions.
That's okay. Quite a fascinating presentation. Beryl Satter is quite the historian, and the documents there to back up the evidence there tended. If this was a litigation, the defendants would look like fools in a court of competent jurisdiction. And I just love how Dr. King tried to dramatize the crisis of housing in Chicago. Quite a fascinating historical lesson here, and a mix of civil rights too. So we got 29 minutes because we want to keep on time. We know you have a very busy schedule. We all have a busy schedule here. So I want to take as many questions as possible. I'm not going to ask that many questions. I want to leave it to our audience. So what we want to do is always when I moderate Q&As, let's lessen the commentary. Let's raise questions. Let's raise questions about Detroit, Chicago, comparative analysis. Let's go to, let's see, who do we have? PG, question or comment?
I have a question for Professor Beryl Satter, and what an excellent presentation. A lot of us, we follow Bankley's show, and he's been really promoting this, and I think this is a great thing. So with redlining being done back then and a form of modern day redlining being done today, how do African Americans protect themselves from redlining? And I know this is far reaching, but with reparations being necessary to right the wrongs, could it be reparations if African Americans were able to get, say, a mortgage at no interest rate? Mm-hmm. What could be done to rectify this and stop it?
Right. Yeah, I think, Jack Macnamara, who passed away recently, who was one of the activists involved with the Contract Buyers League, he had an idea for something called restitution homes that he's trying to make happen in Chicago, and it could happen elsewhere. And it's exactly what you said. It would be, if you are if you either have a direct relationship to, somebody who bought on contract and was exploited, and we know who those people are, we have the records, or if you are in a neighborhood that was hard hit by that, you should be able to get a property with no interest. But also he wants to create a fund so that the properties can be purchased for what is affordable. But affordable, they say affordable, and then it doesn't mean affordable. Affordable has to be 25% about of what you happen to have, not a random 25% of a random income that doesn't relate to who you are. So, but for that, we need money behind it. We need, I think, governmental support. Jack Macnamara thought he could raise, huge amounts of money from the banks and the interests that, and schools and all kinds of people that in one way or another have profited from racial exploitation, and it's certainly for the banks. We know who they are. We know exactly who they are, and many of them are still doing it. So he was hoping to use moral suasion to get them to contribute to this thing. I don't know if that would work. I think something legislative would be better. Right. But I feel like, by documenting the amount of money that was expropriated, the way it was taken, that is so systematic. And we're not talking about a long time ago either. The people are still around. I think that it changes our understanding of the conditions. And then once we understand what had happened, maybe we could rectify it. But, I'm not sure to be hopeful or not, but I think original thinking like that, right, like no interest loans, affordable, really affordable, communities, individuals and communities all have to be taken into account. I think that is what we need.
Right. Let me ask you this, Dr. Satter. Do you see Detroit, because you're very aware of what's happening here, you've lived here, do you see Detroit trending where Chicago was trending in the 50s?
Possibly. I mean, Detroit, there was a lot of housing wealth in Detroit, and a lot of it got wiped out in the subprime crisis, which was a complete recap of the contract selling crisis. I mean, Detroit, there are multiple problems going on at once, which is why Detroit becomes the sort of the bellwether of where the country will be going, i.e. water shutoffs and tax foreclosures and all those things that are interconnected, and schools shutting, and so many things at once. And it's, heartbreaking. But I think that identifying and stopping predatory use of credit, is one important piece, but only one. I mean, I think the issue with tax foreclosures, the way Black Detroiters who held on through thick and thin and then lose the property to a tax foreclosure system that, is stacked against them because they're still paying more taxes than the place is worth. That's pretty scary too. And, it's another version though, unfortunately, of a shared thing, which is about stripping, Black homeowners of wealth, of the thing that for other groups has been used to build wealth. And that's, right. So I think the more sophistication we have in coming at that issue, the more we can articulate a response. And again, including thinking like the answer is not, again, to sort of start as if none of that ever happened. We're not at an even playing field. You have to start with what did happen and remedy it.
Because I asked the question against the backdrop of the Detroit News, a paper that I'm affiliated with as a columnist, did an investigation that found, shocking, from 2010 to 2016, found that the Detroit homeowners were overtaxed by $600 million. Mm-hmm. Even as we speak, no answer has been provided to those homeowners by the administration. The administration right. downtown, but headed by Mayor Mike Duggan, said we've spent the money, basically just move on. So. Mm-hmm. When you talk about the tax issue, it ties into it. I mean, wealth ownership for Black people and all of that. So it's almost as if, I don't know, if history is repeating itself.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's, the old, there was slight variations on how to extract wealth, but it's the same old, in some ways it's the same old story. And then it gets buried under a narrative that it's somehow these people's fault. And that's like the ugliest part in some ways. I mean, it's a huge lie, and it's, blaming the victim, and it completely obfuscates any possibility of any remedy. So I think the number you just cited is quite shocking. We start adding up these billions and you understand the condition, and then where do they go? And how do we, reinvest them back and convince people that it's to the good of everyone to have healthy communities and not starved, devastated ones.
Let me ask you another question, and then let's take some more questions from our listeners here, because the role your father played, I think, is significant. And I was just watching. Your father was a Jewish lawyer, but you also showed the other allies within the Catholic social justice community. Mm-hmm. And I was just speaking to Sister Simone Campbell yesterday about this issue, because the PuLSE Institute was planning a major symposium on tax justice. And Sister Simone was going to keynote it, because she said what happened in Detroit shocks her to her very core, and that is just unacceptable. And then COVID hit 2 weeks later, we had to cancel it. In terms of the allies, though, can you just speak to that? Because I think your father's model is very rare, because he actually put his life on the line. We do have allies, but they're not that committed the way your father was committed. And perhaps maybe one could argue, maybe if he was not in that kind of struggle, not so burdened, maybe he could have been alive today. But I'm just saying that your the role that he played is so unique, because he gave all for the struggle for Black liberation. Talk about, in the modern era here, how important, or how do you see the need? How do we cultivate allies? Like, what your father did in Chicago, and you being able to document that story.
No, I think people of faith, are a good target to bring in to these struggles, because like what the sister said, it shakes them to their core. I mean, Jack Macnamara was a Jesuit. He ended up leaving the seminary and getting married and doing other things, but he he just said, this is just fundamentally wrong, and so I think, non-Black allies, they have to have that kind of moral sense that this is, sickening, and it shouldn't go on. So I think religiously based communities are potential sources of support. I mean, for my father, I showed the picture of him as a child and growing up in the Depression. Jack Egan was his age. There was a whole generation of very class conscious people, white ethnics, as they called them then, that had a sense, sort of a familiarity with how exploitation operated because they grew up in the Depression, and they knew that, you didn't trust big business. And, that narrative is missing, in many ways now, just sort of a kind of a fluency in understanding where that business isn't out to help you, business is out to help itself, and we need to counter it, somehow consciously, with an alternative vision. That doesn't mean hurting them necessarily or stopping them, but don't trust them to make everything better, because they will only use any trust they are given to help themselves, because that's what they are based on. I mean, some will do some good things, but we've gone so far into this, public-private partnership ideas. And there are many examples going forward from the 70s where problems of housing were left in the hands of private industry in a way that only led to their own enrichment. You could think of Quicken Loan claiming that they housed people, when he's busy buying up, skyscrapers in downtown Detroit and throwing the residents out.
And they just, Quicken Loans just got, it was reported by ProPublica, a national nonprofit investigative organization. Quicken Loans just received, tons of opportunity zones tax breaks.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, the opportunity zone stuff. It's all this stuff that if only we are super, super generous and give millions and millions of dollars to people who already have more than enough, then they'll make it better, as opposed to redistributing income so that people who, really need it will really use it to build communities, they don't get that option, So, I mean, what motivates people, it's a complicated thing, and I can't truly answer it. For my father, there were other things going on with him, including having been semi-crippled as a young kid, and all that, every individual. But I do think, young people tend to be very open to hearing about, how the world works and caring, So I feel like youth and people of faith are the way to go.
Right. If you have any other question, just signal us here and I can take your question into Dr. Satter. But I have another question here. In your book, there's so much in the book itself. I think it's a history book, but it's also a history on civil rights. You really explain how the Daley administration in Chicago was able to, I don't know whether the word nullify is the right word, but was able to render the NAACP in Chicago reticent or perhaps toothless, or find a kind of leadership that was malleable to the policies of the Daley administration. And in that way, it was able to do whatever it did without any check. So talk about just the importance of that and what we should be mindful of in a Detroit here, and traditional organizations that would be standing side by side with your father, because I just thought the image of your dad with that in that audience of just all Black people arguing against another white man, I think it's a very powerful image, saying this white man doesn't have your interests. Talk about just the importance of, in our modern era here, for organizations like the NAACP, the obligation here, because we saw the lesson in Chicago, and in Detroit, we're dealing with similar issues with the Detroit NAACP. But I just want to get from your perspective, just what we need to be mindful of, in fighting against predatory lending, redlining, and how governmental agencies or private sector can in fact handicap our civil rights organizations.
Right. Well, what happened in Chicago, we had a lot to do with the era, the Red Scare, and it was a massive attack on all kinds of progressive organizations that had broader visions and were wanting to publicize and fight what was going on, and they were all tarred as communists and, driven underground or just destroyed. so that, the NAACP, was very clever what Daley did. He had, people loyal to him go in and buy up all the membership, get memberships and then vote out the people they didn't like and vote in themselves. So, I mean, that could happen to any organization. They can be co-opted and taken over. And so these are sort of old rule books, that you have to be very careful about. And Daley, the Daley machine, Richard Daley, then mayor of Chicago, it was a hierarchical organization where people got patronage in return for turning out the votes in particular locations. And, people were anointed, ward leaders were anointed with power to distribute more goods if they got the votes. So, he did have a small loyal, some loyal Black council members who did his bidding. There were always independents who didn't. So I guess, I'm not sure like how to directly apply it to contemporary Detroit, except to, I think any group can be co-opted. My book gives examples of how it was done there. A lot of it often has to do with where your funding comes from, people say. And if you are sort of more independently funded and, you don't, that's what happened to the Urban League. The Urban League was funded by some of the bigger industries in the city, and they got rid of the more radical guy and got in someone who's, smoother. But I have to say, Edwin Berry, for all that sometimes these people, they get in the middle of this and they try to work both sides, and I think he did. He made an effort to both placate his funders and still speak as he could. But ultimately, people need to be able to speak free of their funders, and there needs to be some kind of forums, which I think is what the PuLSE Institute is so great at, is bringing people together to express their views and share perspectives and, kind of equalize the playing field a bit so that more people, could say what they think. Grassroots activist organizations are usually on the front lines and know much more about what's happening than anybody else. And, they need help and support. And I could see again, youth and people of faith working to support those organizations, whether through fundraising for them or doing the work that they require. People on the front lines of both property tax foreclosures and the water crisis, they need support. And I think a group like PuLSE that tries to bring people together, make connections, is really important.
Yeah, how has this book been received across the country in terms of urban cities?
You asked me that before, and I wasn't sure quite what you meant, but because I thought, in Chicago, I actually think people in Chicago really liked it. Just FYI, like I think Chicagoans are almost proud of how corrupt their city is, of all the problems there, and it's sort of like, yeah, she really laid it out. Also, people, I talked about. I get emails from people who say, I dated a guy whose brother died in a fire that the arsonist you described set. I live next door to this cellar. People know people. There, I think there's almost, like I said, a perverse pride in like laying out how bad it was, because also it created very strong fighters. The rest of the country, people write and tell me that they, contract selling was a problem in Indiana, in Maryland, in, Michigan, and all these places. I hear from everywhere about this. So, it's read all over the country. And, I think what it does is provoke the discussion about how Black urban communities got to the state they're in, who got the money, how was it drained, who got the profits, how does predatory real estate work? It keeps coming back as a major issue. It wiped out the whole world in 2008 in terms of finances. And so, we got to take this thing seriously. And it's hard to get your head around mortgages and finance and installment contracts as a way to extract wealth, but it's the key way, more than underpayment of wages in some ways. And, or certainly alongside. And so I think that's why the book has had a good reception, because it humanized those stories and explained those processes in a way that whatever city you're in, you could read it and say, wow, let me ask my grandmother, how did you get that place? How did you lose that place? If you had one, how did we end up where we're living? I can't tell you how many people have written to me and say, I was in the middle of all of this. My family either bought this way or sold this way or something, and I had no idea.
Yeah.
So it's very important to understand these processes.
Yeah. Do we have another question from, do we have a question there?
I have a
Oh,
question.
hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, go ahead. Wait.
No, I'm listening. Go ahead.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, she touched on two things. She mentioned the word. She said the youth, and then she said working both sides of the fence. And strangely enough, or coincidentally enough, I'm kind of been thrown in a situation where I'm kind of dealing with both, with what's coming through this part of the community, and because I listen to Redlining and a lot of your guests that you bring on, and Tina, the attorney Tina Patterson, and all, I recognized it right away, or what I foresee it as being, which is gentrification. And speaking of the youth, it's this particular young man who has this organization, with a great concept, but of businesses coming through here, and all the strange combination that you mentioned, working both sides of the fence, is that he also works for big corporations.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to put in front of him what I've heard you teach on your show, Regulate Compton,
Right.
and so that I can put some history in front of him to show him this is, you're straddling the fence. And
Right.
he said, well, I'm not political. And I said, but
Wow.
you are. You're all up in it and don't even realize it. So my question, I feel compelled to step up and do something at this point to try and help shape at least what that looks like in terms of what we want and what we don't want here in this community. And I'm trying to put Black developers in front of, because this city is 80% Black, Detroit is. It makes no sense to me to have anything else come into this space. And I'm trying to, I've actually reached out to 1 million multimillionaire, Black multimillionaire, who's
Okay.
very accessible. That was the only way I was able to reach him, because he's very accessible. You can just simply call up and
Okay.
schedule an appointment with him.
Right.
So I did. And so
Right.
that's my concern, how it's either now or never. So how
Okay.
do I shape this where that's what's coming in here?
Right.
Because it can happen,
Okay.
but it needs to happen now.
Right. Thank you so much. Dr. Satter, I'm going to give that to you, but tell that young man working for that corporation that Dr. King laid the foundation for him, not that corporation he's working for. Go ahead, Dr.
I
Satter.
will. I will tell him
Yeah,
that.
I mean, you're pointing to, a process that's happening in Detroit and in many cities. It's like the next stage, take away the house and resell it, this time to a white developers or outsiders, people who haven't been there for decades and didn't make the sacrifices to hold on all those years, and make more profits that way. And yeah, it's confusing, when you're in the middle of it. And I could see how maybe a young person might say, hey, it's an opportunity, someone's being nice to me. But I think they need to have the more depth of a knowledge about the history of Detroit in particular, and the country in general, to understand why there are so few, community controlled, much less Black controlled types of companies that give back to the communities in which they participate. I mean, some do, but the ones that aren't headquartered and have no deep concern with the city of Detroit are not going to do that. And even those that are headquartered in Detroit may or may not. And I think you kind of, in some ways, have to go on a case-to-case basis, but I think more broadly, a city that's 80% Black is losing ownership, by the day, by the month, to people who have deeper pockets and can profit off of tax foreclosures and things of that sort. And it's unjust, and it needs to be exposed, and organized against. But the alternative is also the hard part. And again, I think for alternatives, talking to local people who've been here forever, who have an idea of how they would like to see their city run and how they would like their communities to be better, improved. I think those are your people like you, the caller, someone who's been here a long time. That's who has to have a chance to say what they want to see, instead of letting an outside corporation, just because it has the money, determine, the future of this urban landscape.
Yeah, so let me ask you just two more questions here, Dr. Satter. Talk about just the toll that this took on you, because this is a remarkable undertaking to put this information together, to go after the documents and so forth, and put all of this together and into what I call we spoke yesterday, before ahead of this. I just said, I told you it seems as if there was a special Jim Crow machine in Chicago that was working right there. I mean, talk about the undertaking in terms of being able to put all of this together into a comprehensive book in a way that people can understand it and take away from it. The undertaking of that and the toll.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't look at any of this stuff until I had gotten tenure at my university, which means that they gave me the permanent job. So, I mean, I always tell people, I think I became a historian in the first place because of these like weird mysteries of my family, where so I knew something had happened before I was like when I was young, but no one could explain it to me and no one was about to. So I realized I had to learn the methods, So I was already knew how to be a historian. So I knew how to go in archives and I knew how to do it. And it was a 10-year undertaking, 10 years. And it was one that people told me not to do because they said, you can't write about your father and you can't write about your own city, well, certainly about your father. They said I would be biased. And I don't think I was, because I really did follow the record. And I also didn't know him, much. I mean, I have a handful of memories of him. So I mean, weirdly, it wasn't as hard to uncover all this as I thought. And some of it had to do with following a specific trail. And that's why I started with the family and the child and all that. It's like, when you have a drive to know, you learn, and I think any of us who's sitting there in a home, in a community, and you're looking around saying, what happened to my next door neighbors? What happened to my grandmother, my sister, my mother? It makes you, puts a little fire under you, And so, and it makes the learning process easier when you care. And so I had the skills, but I also obviously had the drive because, I was able to, answer personal mystery as well as a political mystery. The personal mystery being who was my father? Who was this man? And why are my mother's relatives mad at him, And they were mad at him because he had some properties. I didn't even go into this, but he owned some properties in the West Side and they said, you should sell. When Black people started coming in, he said, I will not do it. And they said, well, then he died and then my mother had to sell them. And I tell the whole story in the book, but, it was at a huge financial loss. And they blamed the family members were like, take care of yourself. Don't take care of other people. And that's an ideology, that we should not care about others and that we are separate. And especially it plays into the racial divide. And, my father wouldn't do it and it created tension. So, I mean, I'm wandering a little bit, but the point is that, however monumental a research project may seem, if you have a personal drive to know, you learn, and, I would encourage everyone to start asking, talking to your family members about how, how they got where they got, they may not always know the bigger picture, but you could start to find out by talking and reading and then talking some more,
Yeah, let me get Lacey Dawson. You want to ask a question? You want to ask a final question here?
Yeah, it seems to be a trend with young people not really wanting to own homes anymore. Is that something that you're seeing? And do you have any recommendations around how we can reinvigorate the mindset that home ownership is wealth, especially for the younger generations?
Great, thank you.
It's a great question, and it's a tough one because the tragic truth is that home ownership for Black people has not always been wealth. It's often been a way to set a trap, and so and that has to do with federal policies that have, disadvantaged Black neighborhoods. So I could see why young people would be wary, and especially now. There are a lot of people talking about alternative forms of property ownership that have to do with land banks and, something, more collective, where both the risk and the responsibility is slightly more diffuse, but you still have a chance to build some wealth. And historically in this country, because of the way the laws work, home ownership has been the way for white people to build wealth. So it's a tricky question. I think African Americans, they need to innovate on one hand, ways so that risk is not all on them, and the other hand, I think the white America has a huge responsibility to even the playing field so that Black wealth is a possibility through home ownership. But that means really stamping out all the predatory tricks that are still used, so I wouldn't tell young people, to do that without at the same time fighting to make sure that it's a safe thing to do.
Yeah. Let me ask you this final question, and then we can round this up. And that is, when you do a comparative analysis, Detroit, Chicago, and given their place in the national discourse for racial and economic justice, where do you see Detroit, Chicago 5 years from now? And what are you most worried about right now? Because this audience, and this has been also live on Facebook as well, so we have a lot of people who have been watching on this on Facebook. Where do you see Detroit and Chicago 5 years from now? And what's the takeaway here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a historian, so I always focus on the past, and a lot rides on this election. The cities are going to be in horrible shape if Trump gets in again somehow or other. It's very important to stop that from happening. He's an overt white supremacist. He is anti-urban, despite making much of his money through real estate speculation of his own, and give debt tricks of all sorts. If he doesn't get in, I think cities could be places of hope and change and incubation, because there are a lot of people in both Chicago and Detroit who are interested in experimentation. They are interested in new forms of community controlled energy, both utilities and forms of farming productivity. There's all kinds of things. Cities are one of the few places where changes in transportation could actually work, and that could be in both Chicago and Detroit. So, and the fact that they both have sizable Black populations, means that these are places where you have people with a great deal of experience managing tough times and innovating ways to work as a community. And I think that lesson needs to be, they need to be in the, people need to listen to that, and let that be, leadership.
Right.
Leadership should not be in, wealthy people who've never had to struggle a day in their life and have no idea that the deck is stacked or claim not to know. It should be with people who have had day-to-day experience. So, so I'd say it's about the election, and
Right.
And I'm going to keep my, I think we all need to get out and vote. And I've heard that turnout in Detroit is low, similar. I don't know about in Chicago, but it's very important to do it, because this is the fate of the planet.
Right.
At this point is hanging on this in terms of environmental destruction, and so that's what I would say.
Okay. Well, look, I want to thank you. Your father's work, documented in this book, is a gift to all of us who are in the struggle for economic justice. I think that's evident, because the issues that you unraveled in this book, family properties, are the same issues that we continue to speak, write about, and talk about, and raise hell about. And so I think this was a wonderful opportunity to engage our audience here in this Zoom planet, in this planet of Zoom, and those who were watching on Facebook as well. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here. I hope to keep in touch with you. Hopefully we can have you on the radio as well. I'd like to have you on my radio show and maybe give you an hour to take questions from our listeners across the state in Ohio and all of that, because I think it's important. I think what you're saying is important, and we need to get this information out there as much as possible. Again, thank you so much for being here.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. Take
Thank
care,
you.
and
All
we'll
right.
stay in touch.
Definitely. Dr. Beryl Satter, Professor of History at Rutgers University here. To all of those who have been joining us this evening, thank you so much for being here. Of course, our President and Director of Research, Attorney Patterson, to all of you who tuned in. And of course, Janice Carney here, one of our National Advisory Panel members, Janice Carney, former presidential diarist under President Bill Clinton, joining us from Arkansas. Thank you all for being here again. Thanks again. And so we'll inform you of our next series in this PuLSE Literary Circle. Have a good evening.